Hello and welcome to First Contact, the world's first podcast where we openly discuss all things relating to humanity's preparation for open contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. I'm your host, Isha Patel. If you are loving this content, please be sure to join us in the First Contact Facebook community and let us know what you think. Let's dive into another exciting episode of First Contact. So I'm on a mission to investigate as much as I can about UFOs, UAPs. I keep changing the name. I guess I want to find out your wealth of wisdom. It seems like you've done quite a lot of research in the space. You've been director of MUFON for a little bit, if I've got that correct. So I guess I really just wanted to bring you onto this particular show for two reasons. One is my personal research. This is just really interesting stuff for me. So I've gone down the rabbit hole. I've been researching for about 8 years now myself, and we've just decided to launch this media company to try and get more of that message out there, and just really start bringing that truth to the public. So that's part of it, and then it's also just about creating more conversation and discussion as well, because I mean there is already a lot out there. A lot of people have written books, a lot of podcasts and things already, but there have been some recent legislative changes, particularly in the United States. And it seems to be a bit of a hot topic right now. So, I mean, if we had hours and hours, I would just say, look, tell me everything that you know. But okay. I think that might be a lot. So where we might begin, if you can just start by introducing yourself so people know a little bit about who you are, why they should listen to you, and just a little bit of your background, and we'll go from there.
Well, very simply, my name is James Clarkson, and I have been researching the topic of UFOs probably most of my adult life, and I'm 71 years old right now. I spent, when I was working, I was a police officer for 20 years. I'm an honorably discharged plainclothes military policeman. Before I did that, I spent 10 years as a fraud investigator and 2 years as a child abuse detective. So I have a lot of experience interviewing people, organizing investigative reports. Meanwhile, I have this whole other side to my life that started when I was, I guess, little, because I was a child of the 50s. I was born in 51, and I grew up with science fiction, and it just became part of my life. I got taken to the Morrison Planetarium in San Francisco when I was a boy numerous times. I was fascinated looking up at the night sky. Eventually, I started, it all boils down to a radio show, actually. This was back in the late 60s. There was a radio program, KGO Radio in New York and San Francisco were linked up. They had an author named John G. Fuller on, and they were interviewing him. And he had just introduced a brand new book called Incident at Exeter, referring to a series of UFO sightings that occurred in Exeter, New Hampshire. And I was utterly fascinated because the primary witnesses in the story were on-duty policemen. And I, of course, was already beginning to think that someday I might follow that path. So I was just completely mystified, and it was kind of like there was a missing piece got put in and activated. So I started collecting articles, books, anything I could find. And eventually, of course, we're skipping forward quite a few years. I was in the Army, and this was actually in between 1974 and 1977. And I was at the military police station at Fort Lewis, Washington. And you have to bear in mind, that's the provost marshal's office. It's the center for the military police on this huge military base. In fact, it was described to me that during the daytime when all the civilian employees were there, it was the 5th largest city in the state of Washington.
Wow. I'm
looking down at the desk sergeant's desk, and he and I are having coffee because my office as the duty plainclothes MP was in the same building. And I'm looking down at his desk, and I'm looking at all these business cards, and I see one that says National UFO Reporting Center. 206-7223,000. I said, Sarge, what's that? And he looks at me very matter of fact and says, that's where we report UFOs. Well, we had a discussion about UFOs, and he'd seen some strange things while he was in Germany and whatnot, but I kind of filed that away in the back of my mind.
That's huge. So what year was that?
That would have been about 1976.
Right.
I got out of the Army in late 77. I ended up, going on and joining the Aberdeen Police Department after I, was a reserve deputy sheriff, went to school for a while, that kind of thing. Flashing forward, late in December of 1986, there was a world famous UFO sighting. This one went round the world. Every major news outlet covered it. It was about a 747 pilot, a Japanese pilot named Kenji Toroshi, flying a JAL cargo liner into Fairbanks, Alaska. And while he was en route, he and his crew observed a gigantic UFO. In other words, like the size of city blocks. He even drew a little diagram of how big this thing was compared to his 747. And initially, when he reported it, the Federal Aviation Administration confirmed that they had it on radar. And then, of course, later on, they said, oh, no, we didn't really have it on radar. You must have misunderstood. Of course, it turned out that the CIA had gotten involved and told them not to talk about it, taking the tapes away, etc. But this went all over the news. And in fact, I still have the press release packet. I was totally I thought, this is great. Well, now that I was out of the Army, I called that number that I had filed away in the back of my brain to 206-722-3000. And a man named Robert Gribble answered the phone. And he was a retired Seattle firefighter, but he loved UFOs. And out of his own money, he had started the UFO hotline, which still exists to this day. That's the National UFO Reporting Center. It's nuforc.org. It's run by Peter Davenport. So I called the number and I said, I don't want to report a UFO. I want to help. And he said, have you ever heard of MUFON? And until that moment, I didn't know anything about it. I ended up joining MUFON and I was a member for 30 years. I lived about 75, 80 miles from Seattle, which was where the state directors lived and where they had the meetings. I couldn't attend every meeting because I was, by that point, I was married with a new family, working full-time as a police officer, and I did UFOs on the side, fitting it in where I could. Well, that's how I met Peter Davenport. When I went to the meetings, there's a name, in fact, that he's still world famous. He took over the UFO Reporting Center after Bob Gribble retired. And Peter and I have been friends 30, 40 years now. We still call each other once a week or so, although now he lives over east of the mountains because he got tired of Seattle. But anyhow, I started working cases for MUFON. Because I was a trained police officer, they made me a state section director. Eventually, Larry and Marilyn Childs, this is years later, decided that they could no longer be state director, and so they gave the job to me. I was the state director in Washington for 10 years, up until 2017, when, for a variety of reasons, I decided it was time to go. And I'm still heavily involved in UFO research. In fact, I'm working on my next book project right now, which is about another very, very famous sighting that involved a on-duty deputy sheriff in Portage County, Ohio, April 17th, 1966 at 5 a.m., he and his reserve partner chased a UFO down the highways from the middle of Ohio all the way over into the next state, Pennsylvania, a distance of over 80 miles at speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. They could see this thing ahead of them. It had a coherent cone of light underneath it, and it would bob from side to side as it moved. And the weirdest thing was that it would go just fast enough to make them accelerate. And then whenever they would start to close on it, it'd pull away a little bit. And then if they got caught in traffic, it would slow down and wait for them. So in fact, there's a very humorous interpretation of this event was included in the very famous movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Steven Spielberg's big classic. So that was, would have been a good story, except that it didn't work out very well for this deputy sheriff. The news media, for a variety of reasons, which I've been exploring not only this event, but everything that led up to it, there was a huge amount of media attention on UFOs because of what had happened the previous month. That would have been March 1966 in Michigan. There were some very famous UFO sightings. And when Dr. Hynek went in there, he was the Air Force consultant. He ended up saying, well, maybe it was swamp gas. Well, the press took that up and the public was outraged and the Air Force was embarrassed because of the public uproar. They wanted the Air Force wants everybody to believe anything they say. And they basically want to tell everybody it's all under control. We know what it is. Don't worry about it. Nothing to see here. Go home. And obviously it didn't work out that way. So the little town of Ravenna, Ohio was besieged with news media. Dale Spower basically had a nervous breakdown. He got into a terrible fight with his wife that I literally face to face have met his son. I went back to Ohio and met him. And it's kind of tragic because he's a homeless veteran. And he told me that his mother said that the one thing she really regretted was that she knew that her husband Dale was way on edge. And they even had news reporters in and around their house. They couldn't get any peace because there was so much media attention. And she said, I should have never provoked him into an argument. Well, he kind of roughed her up a little bit. She divorced him. He lost his job. He ended up, for a long time being almost homeless himself, subsisting on, nothing jobs. And eventually he ended up owning a bar and he died, I think, I know when he died. He died in 1984. And he was just a broken man. I mean, he managed to do a few things after that. He got married again and whatnot, but he wanted to be a deputy sheriff. And he was an Air Force veteran. I'm very concerned with the human stories behind UFO events. I tell people this, I do a lot of public outreach. I've done numerous library lectures all over the place that I used to live in. We lived in Aberdeen, Washington, and then Olympia, Washington. I'm up on the Olympic Peninsula. I'm in the northwest corner of the United States and have been. I came here because of the Army and I never left because, quite frankly, Washington State is so utterly beautiful. It still is. We're starting to get too many people in some places, but basically it's flat out gorgeous.
I'm actually really curious about, some of the things that you've personally seen. I mean, you came across this department way back when that was investigating UFOs. One of the big questions I think that's definitely on my mind and probably a lot of other people too is, I mean, look, there's enough evidence out there, there's enough evidence. There's, like Project Blue Book files have been declassified. Like there's so much out there. And the question that I'm getting into at the moment is, well, then why aren't they just telling us? It says to me that there is something to hide, or there's something that they're afraid of will happen if they just disclose the truth. And even if they don't, my philosophy coming into this has just been like, you know what, even if the government doesn't disclose anything, we're very capable human beings on this planet. We can disclose it ourselves, like we can do the research, we can find the evidence. We don't need an official government statement in order to just go, you know what, guys, this stuff is real. Let's just get on with it. And so at some point, the government will then just have to go, oh, yeah, you've been right all along. We're like, no shit, like, I think that's kind of what's going to happen. Like a lot of people I ask them, I say, so do you think disclosure is happening anytime soon? And most of them say no. They say, well, look, even what's been happening recently with the balloons in Montana and things like that, it's like they're saying it's just a repeat of history with what happened in Roswell. They'll come out and say, oh, it's a UFO. Oh, no, it's not. Oh, no, it's something else. Oh, there's a prosaic explanation for this. And so we're seeing that cycle happen again. But at the same time, people are smarter than they were like all those years ago. We don't trust the media 100%. We take everything with a grain of salt. I think the general public is a little bit more clued in and intelligent. And so there's a lot of people out there, not just niche, researchers like myself, but also just the wider general public are smarter than that now. And they know that there's something that the government is trying to hide. But there still begs the question of why. Why won't they just tell us what we already know?
I think that the answer to that is very complex. And my take on that is, number one, we have to be really careful when we say the government. The government is not a monolith.
Right.
And probably if you could take out 97% of the people who work for the United States government in any branch, and you and I probably know more about UFOs than any of them.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a small percentage who got a hold of this secret a long time ago. I just finished going through a book called The Presidents and the UFOs. And it describes the whole evolution of secrecy, how this started back with Harry Truman and came forward. There was a decision made early on. I mean, look, first off, think about the poor Air Force. I know I'm always coming down on them as a UFO researcher, but let's go back in history. In World War II, there was no United States Air Force. It did not exist. There was the Army Air Corps, and there were naval aviators, but there was no United States Air Force. In 1947, by coincidence, they passed the National Security Act late in the year, which was a couple, 3 months after Roswell. The National Security Act consolidated all of these branches of government under a central command. It created the United States Air Force, and it created the Central Intelligence Agency. Those agencies did not exist until that moment. And I keep thinking, I want to say that maybe part of me suspects that they were reacting to what they were confronted with. The world had just been through a horrific war. It changed everything about everybody. I mean, my father was a 7-year veteran in the Navy. He met my mother in San Francisco. I've started all the people from the baby boomer generation. Most of us wouldn't have existed if it wasn't for World War II, because the whole country got mixed up. A lot of people, my wife included, they're children of people who would have never met if it wasn't for the war. So the whole world had been changed. People were glad to have it over and done with. Now suddenly in 1947, the government is confronted with a whole other level of reality, and they don't know what to do. Evidence of non-human intelligence manifested with technology that we can't duplicate, that nobody can duplicate. And they thought the only way we can handle this is to keep it absolutely secret, to buy time to figure out what we're going to do. And they probably secretly hoped that they could use that technology to get an edge over everybody else. But then there are people who would say, well, wait a minute, if we've got a crashed UFO at Roswell, what happens if they got one over in Russia and they're not telling us about it? You know, there's a lot of suspicion. So they keep it very, very secret. They make it the highest possible classification. In fact, there's Wilford Smith from Canada, the famous, he talked about that he had learned that the UFO secret was classified higher than the hydrogen bomb in security.
That doesn't surprise me.
No, and I think it's true. I also think, especially because this last 4th of July, I had the honor of being one of the speakers at the 75th anniversary of the crash in Roswell. I was there, and I was part of the number of speakers that were at the UFO Museum, and that makes me really happy because of a friend of mine who is no longer with us, who inspired me to go forward in all of my UFO research, and I wrote a book about her. But that's getting off at another tangent. But I got to meet Lou Elizondo there.
Yeah.
And you recognize his name.
Oh, absolutely. I have been trying to get a hold of him to get him on here.
He's one of the busiest people in the world.
I know.
I went up to him because he was two tables down from me. And I will tell you, our beginning conversation, I was friendly and polite, but I was not happy because I have had some grave reservations ever since the rock star, Tom DeLonge. He used to be in Blink 182.
Yeah.
That wasn't my era of music, but I happen to
I grew up with Blink 182. I'm a huge fan.
Okay. But I'm from the 60s, you know.
Yeah,
Hendrix,
yeah.
the Airplane, but and Led Zeppelin. But that whole thing, when he suddenly became Mr. UFO and he created the To the Stars Academy, and then I saw this board of directors that he had, and they blew me away because I started looking at them. They were so much, it was like the CIA old home week. One man had 25 or 30 years in the CIA. Somebody else was involved in bio warfare. I mean, I'm thinking, and we're supposed to believe that you went to Washington, D.C., and you went there and you convinced all these people to come out and tell us all these great UFO truths. That's not what's happening. What's happening is there is an internal war going on inside the government. There are factions fighting, and one side, and they don't dare come out public because, for one thing, they've all signed non-disclosure agreements. And I can't imagine what a non-disclosure agreement must look like if you've worked 20 years for the CIA. Probably that's a promise by the CIA that if you break your security agreement, they won't mess you up so badly that you have to have a closed coffin funeral. Because they play rough. You know, if you start letting the cat out of the bag and telling people the truth about UFOs, I mean, it's one thing. They're not going to come after somebody like me because I just have a research. I'm just a researcher. But if I actually had certain things, you could be in real serious trouble if you start talking. They might want to make you disappear.
Well, I think that's where the recent documentation that's come out from Biden just in December actually makes a big difference because he's calling forward these sort of like whistleblowers that aren't really whistleblowers now because they're being asked to do it. So I think that's where the big shift is. Yeah.
But I talked to Lou Elizondo and I told him my misgivings about Tom DeLonge's group. And he said, I'm going to just tell you, he said, in this whole thing, there are white hats and there are black hats. And he said, I'm a white hat. and the people with me are white hats. We're on your side.
Mm.
You just have to trust me. And after talking to him a few more minutes, I decided he's one of the good guys. I don't pretend to know the entire agenda. How could I? We don't know what it's like to have been an insider in that kind of environment.
Yeah.
But they're doing the best they can to get it out there. The other thing is, having been a policeman for many, many years, people are not always, how can I say this delicately? They're not always the brightest. They don't always make good decisions. They can be panicked. A few people can be enlightened, but a mob is a very dangerous thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure everybody is ready for aliens.
Well, this is a big part of the conversations I'm having as well. And part of what I want to do is create that framework of how we can, I feel like it has to come from inside the ufology community, a pathway for that disclosure that's done in a way that people can actually digest. So I do, from that perspective, understand the drip feeding, because some of the biggest shifts that are going to happen, well, for starters, if the government, if all of our country's governments came out at the same time and said, well, actually, yes, this is real, then the first question that's going to be on a lot of people's minds is going to be, well, is this a national security threat? What does that mean for us in terms of security, military? So some people will definitely think about that. But the other thing that's going to happen, and this will be widespread across the board, is it changes our very fundamental human identity. And that, for some people, is a lot to take in. We are used to being, like the apex predator of this planet, as naive as that is, that is what we're used to. And when you go and tell a population of 7.9 billion people that, oh, sorry, guys, there are beings out there in this universe that are operating in multidimensional time space, who have intelligent technology, who are far superior in so many industries that we are not even remotely close to, that is huge. It's quite threatening to, you could say, the human ego, the human identity, a very fundamental concept of who we are. And this is where, I feel like when this does happen, all the life coaches out there are going to have a field day, because they're going to be stepping in and supporting everyone, if they can, if they're not having a meltdown themselves, So, exactly. So I can see the writing on the wall. It's so clear that if this is not done properly, that there is room for this to happen in a not great way. The worst case scenario of this is it leads to intergalactic war. And obviously nobody actually wants that. And so there is a question of, well, how do we disclose this to the public in a way that people are going to be able to digest, and start talking about how to do it in a way that allays the fears of the general public, but also the government, because I suspect there is fear coming from the government too, that if they disclose something, that there will be repercussions to that. I mean, from what I know about the United States are very patriotic people. As soon as they find out that the government has hidden information or done something like this, there's room for big uproar, revolutionary movements, rioting, like all sorts. And so there is a question mark as to how do we do this in a way where all the parties are working together, and we don't upset the general public in such a way that there is going to be a big uproar. Because at the end of the day, I love Avi Loeb's take on this. He says we're naive to think that it's just us in this entire vast universe, and that it's very likely that there are beings out there who have a higher level of intelligence. And a lot of the people in the UFO space, they do come at it from messages of peace, harmonization. There's a very loving sort of approach in all this. The question is, are we mature enough as a human race to actually go down and experience that reality? Or is it going to be like all hell breaks loose and intergalactic war, which I really hope it isn't. So I think there's a lot of questions in that space.
Wouldn't be much of a war.
Well, yeah, we certainly wouldn't be surviving if it was. I think that would be the end of the planet. But But I also I do believe that, and this is, this is from personal experience, also from a lot of people that I've spoken to as well. I've spoken to a lot of abductees as well. And there seems to be across the board a consensus that the majority of these beings, not all, but the majority of these beings do actually want to help us as a human race. They're here to help us. They're here to help us advance technology. They're here to help us advance medicine. I've spoken to people who've received healing powers as a result of connecting with these beings, like, or being in proximity to some of these starships. So there's a lot of positive hope in that as well. And I think that's where I like to sort of place that focus and go, okay, cool. There is hope. There is a great potential in this.
Yes.
Let's not go too down the rabbit hole of doom and gloom, because I think there is a very positive, enlightening pathway into this as well. I guess one of my biggest questions for you, now you've worked in MUFON for such a long time. You've been actually on the front lines, interviewing people, listening to their stories. Now, assuming that there are some people out there who are absolute full of crock and just, making up stories. We put those people aside for a second. I'm sure in everything that you've been through, sifting through all of that material, you have found some very authentic material and evidence. I'd love for you to share some of that with us so that we can get an idea of some of the things that you've seen that lend evidence to the existence of these beings.
Okay, number one, I personally have investigated over 2,000 cases over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them were with MUFON. A lot of them were on the side. I can tell you that the numbers that I came up with are roughly the same that the Air Force actually came up with, and a number of other sources. It always seems to sort out this way. And I'll just give it to you very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
If you hold up your 10 fingers and say those are 10 UFO cases, okay, out of that, there are going to be 3 or 4 that are man-made or natural phenomena, and the person thought it was a UFO, as in an alien craft, but it's actually a planet, a satellite. You'd be surprised how many people do not bother to learn anything about the regular night sky, and immediately they make a pronouncement. Okay, so you eliminate those. There are going to be 3 or 4 of them that you're never going to solve because they just don't have sufficient evidence. And that happens in any investigative organization. It happens in the criminal world, the civil world, the UFO world. Sometimes you just don't have enough information that you can really safely say, okay, my investigation's finished, and this is what I think it was. I think that, you just have to take that information and set it aside and hope that later on you will learn something that will help. Okay. There will be 2 cases out of every 10, 20% are UFO gold. Those are also known as TRUFOs, true UFOs. High credibility witness combined with a high strangeness event. That's what we're all looking for. That's, I liken being a UFO investigator or a MUFON state director or whatever. It's like being a gold miner, an old prospector. You're out there, with the mud and the gravel trying to look for those nuggets of gold. That's what we're all searching for when we're investigating UFOs. What have I concluded from all of the cases that were high strangeness? There obviously is some kind of an intelligent force operating on the earth that is not under anybody's control that's human. It can come and go when it wants. It does, but it doesn't appear after all this time that they are directly interfering with us, except in a few select circumstances, such as shutting down some of our ICBM missiles, as actually happened. I've actually talked to the officers that were on duty. There's a book called UFOs and Nukes. That's the other thing that's very interesting about the UFO phenomena. UFOs and all things nuclear go together like coffee and cream or bread and butter. Wherever you have one, you have the other. And, he spent years interviewing people who had worked on basically high security nuclear sites or missile silos or nuclear weapons depots. And all of these people had stories to relate that will make your hair stand on end because they are so strange. You know, something is coming in and scanning our nuclear facilities.
Could you give me just one example of one of these stories that you've heard from someone?
Well, I didn't hear it directly, but you can take the ones over in Eastern. Oh, I did have one that I did take directly.
Yeah.
Up here outside of Seattle, in fact, it's not terribly far from where I live, is a place called Bangor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a place where the nuclear submarines go to get their armaments refitted. And they don't like to talk about this to the public very often, but it actually is a rather large collection of nuclear warheads.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked to a guard who worked there after he got out, and he reported that one night when he was on duty, he saw basically a ball of energy that slowly moved over this restricted area. And he heard the other posts talking about it. So everybody was seeing it. And it never was clear why it was there, but it got very close to all of these bunkers that contain nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually it moved away. And they were actually debating whether they were going to fire on this thing because it was in a highly restricted area.
Mm-hmm.
That same night, Peter Davenport took 3 or 4 UFO reports from the Puget Sound area and Eastern Washington about strange craft in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one that I personally took.
Mm-hmm.
But it fits into this bigger picture of, for instance, nuclear weapons being compromised at various missile silos, the work of Robert Salas.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he sat next to me in Roswell this last year. And so there are numerous witnesses. This is real. They've had many of those people have testified in the open on camera at the National Press Club. In fact, somebody told me they're getting ready to do another one of those in Washington, D.C., where they bring together key UFO witnesses to talk about what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, you mentioned the politics of the recent years. Did you watch the UAP conference, the part that was open to the public? That was back, was it 2022? Yes. It was in the middle of the year. I want to say maybe it was May, where they had the UAP hearings. They had part was for the public and part was behind closed doors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the public part, I haven't watched the whole thing, but the public part, same as the report. They
It's kind of blah, blah, blah.
it was a bit like they said stuff, but they didn't really say stuff. And it was just, it wasn't really,
There was one gentleman there, though. The whole thing was worth the price of admission just to see what United States Representative Gallagher did. And it's about 54 minutes in. He actually started asking about UFOs interfering with nuclear missiles and said that he wanted them to report back to him what they found out. And of course, the 2 talking heads from the Defense Department, they conveniently know nothing about anything related to UFOs. They are trying to deny our history. That's probably the biggest thing that irritates me right now, more than anything else. I resent the whole UAP idea. But of course, I've called them UFOs forever. So telling me I have to call them UAPs doesn't sit well with me anyway. But I sort of see it as a Madison Avenue rebranding. They were trying to pretend that before they had that series of UFO encounters off the coast of California in 2004, they were trying to say, well, they don't even talk about UFOs before that. Everything started then. Everything started with the Tic Tac video.
Mm.
Come on, anybody who's studied this subject for more than 5 minutes knows that you can go as far back in history as you want and find UFOs. We
Mm.
use Roswell in the United States because that's a convenient starting point.
Mm.
But
But even
actually,
before that, I mean, there's pictures on caves of these star beings and
of
UFOs
course,
in the sky. So I mean, this isn't just the last 75 years. We're talking thousands and thousands of years there's been visitations.
isn't it down in Ayers Rock? They have those pictures of the have been there for thousands of years of the strange beings with
Yeah.
big
It's actually quite prominent in Australian Indigenous history. I spoke with somebody, this was quite a few years ago, maybe like 10 years back. There's a couple of people here in Western Australia who talk about the Indigenous history from a cosmic perspective. And they tell you the stories of the emu and the seven sisters, the Pleiades and things. And so when you listen to that, you realize it's been part of their mythology for such a long time. And if you actually talk to, like, I've spoken to a couple of these elders in the local community, and they've literally said, yeah, we know these beings exist, that it's real. Like, we can't understand why these other people aren't knowledgeable about this stuff, because if you speak to the Indigenous people here, they're all over it. It's part of their everyday culture. You can go and talk to any Indigenous elder here, and they'll probably tell you that, yeah, we have stories of these different star people, and this is what makes up our history.
I would love to do that. In the United States, there is a woman from the University of Montana. I believe, a degreed professor. She devoted her life to social work to benefit impoverished Native American youth.
Mm.
And she also had this hobby. She visited just about every indigenous tribe in North America and quite a few of them in Central and South America. And she knew, because she herself is Native American, she knew how to approach the elders in
Mm.
every tribe. And she said, very respectfully, I will not reveal your name. I will not put you in an awkward position. All I would like you to do is tell me stories of the star people.
Mm.
And she wrote a whole series of books that are just mind boggling. You can't prove any of these. You have to take them on faith that they're true stories. Her
Mm.
name is Artie Six Killer Clark, and her
Mm-hmm.
books are brilliant. And when you read her stories, you walk away and you realize that, there are people in this world who live with that reality all the
Mm.
time. They're
Well, I
not
was watching
debating it.
something on Ancient Aliens on the History Channel. They actually go into quite a few of these different stories from different perspectives, like archaeological, historical, anthropological perspectives. And there was one segment about an African tribe that they were talking about, and they have in their mythology, they talk about Sirius B, like how the star people come from Sirius B, and you can't see Sirius B with the naked eye. We're talking thousands of years ago, before telescopes, before we had the astronomical evidence of the fact that it is actually a binary star system. When you look up at the night sky, you can see Sirius, but you can't see Sirius B. And so all in their mythology, they talk about how these beings have come from specifically Sirius B. It's like, well, how do they know that? They knew all about the binary star system, like the stuff that you wouldn't have known, because the actual knowledge of that stuff came much, much later on. Because I mean, it's only the last couple of 100 years that we've really started discovering stuff about our galaxies and about the universe in a more, I guess, detailed sort of way. And this is like thousands of years ago. So I mean, there's a lot to be said for the indigenous knowledge as well. And I think, like, there is a bit of a distinction, I think, and I've noticed this through my research as well. There's the ancient stuff, then there's modern ufology,
Yes.
and modern ufology tends to be anything sort of post Roswell. That seems to be what they
Right.
consider the modern era. And so any cases that have happened in the last 75 years get lumped into this modern ufology, and then anything that's hundreds or thousands of years ago seems to sit more in that mythological kind of space, from what I've seen.
Of course, I live in Washington State, so we always tell people it's post Kenneth Arnold, because
Right,
Kenneth
right,
Arnold
right,
saw the UFOs on Mount Rainier about 3 weeks before Roswell. It was
right.
June 24th, 1947.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right; those are like the pivotal events.
Mm.
as to how we describe our history.
And there's
Uh,
there's other arms in this as well, you know, and I've spoken to other people about this, and people seem to have different perspectives. I don't know where you sit on the spectrum of this, but there's also a lot of people in the psychic and spiritual space who you know have these connections and stuff. Of course, a lot of that stuff is quite anecdotal. So it's a bit hard to come at it from an academic perspective when people are like, well, I meditate and I connect with these beings. Now, I'm totally, I have to say, I've got bias in that space because I've been a spiritual mentor for 8 years. And so I understand that realm very well. But in saying that, you know, if we're coming at it from a purely scientific academic perspective, even if we put aside all the spiritual woo-woo stuff, there's enough hard factual evidence to suggest that we've been visited by these beings.
yes.
So going back to your work in MUFON,
Yes.
I mean, if people wanted to, you know, find this research, is there something that's publicly available that's being released from all of this data
This is where it gets tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. MUFON has struggled. Let me say this fairly. MUFON has struggled with its own identity. And part of that is because of the money angle.
Yeah.
It's very hard to run a large organization and have enough money to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
And there have been times when MUFON was right on the bitter edge of falling apart.
Yeah. Well, it's nonprofit, right? Which is
right. I mean, it's also had problems
challenges.
With being infiltrated by government agencies or people with political agendas. Right. This is mostly at the headquarters level.
Mm.
In other words, the access to what they call CMS, the case management system, you have to be a MUFON member to get into that management system.
Right.
And so it isn't really published per se, other than if you dig in, you can find people who have publicized key cases in it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you know, everybody does a little bit here and there. I wrote 2 books based on my research, my two primary pieces of research. This is about June Crane, and the other one is about the Westport UFO crash. Mm-hmm. They are, you know, unrelated events, but they were in the area where I was living and working. Mm-hmm. And it's all because I was starting in 1993, I started doing a lot of public outreach, doing library programs where I would go out and talk about UFOs. And, you know, I use my law enforcement experience as a basis of giving me some credibility. And therefore, though, I'm willing to speculate. I believe very strongly in all things spiritual. In fact, I'm trying to improve and advance myself. You should be talking to my wife about that because she is a retired hospice nurse, and she also reads palms and does tarot for people.
Nice.
Does readings for personal insight. And she also wrote a book called There's Always a Miracle. But in any event, back to talking about the UFO research. One night when I was done out in Ocean Shores, Washington, with a library program, an elderly lady who turned out to be a pillar of the community came up and said, "You're right. The government knows all about UFOs and they're keeping it a secret."
Mm-hmm.
I could tell she was.
What was her basis for saying that?
She said, "I worked there." And she was completely serious. It took her 4 years to talk to me.
Who is it?
Her name was June Crane. And it took her until 1997. Now, flashing forward to 1997, we had, was it March 13th, was the Phoenix Lights. That was the same year that was the 50th anniversary of Roswell. And of course, the Air Force responded to that by publishing their big book called Roswell Case Closed, and said that actually Roswell was the Mogul Balloon Project. And oh, by the way, we used to drop dummies that were green off parachutes out in the deserts, and they were mistaken for aliens. So you all can just go home and forget about it because we've now told you the truth and explained it all. That didn't go over too well. Well, when that hit CNN, this lady, June, called me on the phone, not having heard from her in 4 years. The first thing she says is, "It's a damn lie." And I said, "Well, how are you, June?" She, "Are you watching CNN?" And I said, "Yes, they got all this Roswell case closed." And she said, "Those are the same lies that we used to tell the public when I worked there." Well, it turned out that between 1943 and 1953, she worked in top secret laboratories at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And one of the things I learned as a detective, when you go into any business environment, if you want to find out what's going on, the boss is pretty useless usually. The person that you want to make friends with is the administrative secretary. Whoever does all the key clerical work, they are the ones who know everything about the organization. And she worked in a room full of scientists and engineers. And she told me basically that in a top secret environment, the way they talk about UFOs behind closed doors, where everybody has the same security clearance, is a whole lot different than what they tell the public.
Right.
And she disclosed a number of things to me that I ended up writing a book about. And it was, unfortunately, when I first talked to her, I said, "How come you're willing to talk to me now and you weren't then?" And she said, "I'm 72 years old. My cancer's in remission. I've outlived 2 husbands. What are they going to do? Shoot me or put me in prison? I can do either one." Well, her cancer was not quite that far gone. And I only got to know her really well for about a year. But we actually became friends. And she was an extraordinary individual. And by telling her story, it opened all it, when she was dying, the last time I talked to her, I said, "What do you want me to do, June?" And she said, "Tell my story. You know, don't let me be forgotten." I've told her story all over the United States. In 2010, I was in Paris and I got to tell the members of Les Repas Ufologiques, the people who meet once a month in Paris to talk about UFOs over dinner. They're a lot of fun. And I got to tell them Jude's story. I have sold books. I've even sent some of my books to India. So I have made it my mission, because June is a person that everybody could understand. She came from a poor background, broken home. She ended up, getting this job because she was very good in high school. She passed all the tests and was hired for her clerical efficiency. She was rising up through various positions as a civilian employee, but along the way she got married and they had a baby. And like it was back then, a woman had to go where her husband wanted her to go. She was given an opportunity to work in the fledgling space program, but she had to walk away from that. It was the one thing she really regretted, because she had to go with her husband. He ended up cheating on her anyway. And all of that. I investigated every part of her life that could be independently verified and found her to be 100% accurate and 100% reliable. Now, did she have all kinds of smoking gun evidence? Only in a couple instances. But she actually handled a piece of the memory metal, because an officer came in one day and wanted to impress her. Bear in mind, she's a young, attractive woman. She's the only woman in the office. So this guy is hitting on her. And he says, "June, you're a good worker. Take this, you tear it up, cut it up with those scissors." And lo and behold, it's like about the size of a business card. She attacks it with the scissors. You can't cut it. You can't dent it. You can't do anything to it. But you can wad it up into a ball. And when you let it go, it goes back to its original shape, like water, with no wrinkles, like it had never been folded up. And, I even pushed her a little bit when she described it. I said, "June, you've been around. This is 50 years ago. We have all these miracle plastics." She says, no, 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 nobody has metal like that. And she asked this officer, she said, where did this come from? And he says, it's a piece of a spaceship. And she says, where did it really come from? It's a piece of a spaceship. And about that time, somebody else walks through the area. He grabs it, sticks it in his pocket, and does one of those, oh, well, we weren't really talking routines, pretending like they hadn't even talked. And there were other anecdotes like that in her story. And when you put it all together, is it the solution to it all? No. But she was able to look me in the eye and say that by the time she left in 53, the Air Force knew about 3 crash retrievals, not just Roswell. There were at least 2 more. And I ended up taking that in front of some of the researchers, key researchers in the field, and they were quite startled to hear about that because they had heard the same thing from other people. It wasn't just one crashed UFO, it was at least 3 by then.
Yeah.
So she opened a lot of doors for me. That's probably, if I had to say, what has Jim Clarkson accomplished as a ufologist? Well, Jim Clarkson became friends with June Crane and brought her story to other people. And people seemed to resonate with it because she was a woman that everybody could relate to. She'd be like your next door neighbor or, somebody down the street who had worked in a classified government job. And this is what they know. And there are many, many more out there. And when you put it all together, you're right. The evidence is overwhelming. We are not alone. We have been visited repeatedly.
Well, James, thank you so much for being here with us today. It has been an absolute pleasure. And thank you so much for being generous with your time. I think it's so important to keep having this conversation. So really appreciate you. And for anyone who wants to connect with James Clarkson, we'll put his links in the description below. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to First Contact. I'm your host Isha Patel, and I'm so excited to have this conversation about open contact with extraterrestrial beings. Come join me in the Facebook community where you can continue the discussion or keep listening for another episode of First Contact.